I'm very pleased to be able to welcome you to this session entitled Shortcuts from Theatre to Art Gallery, presented in partnership with Art Dubai and the Sharjah Art Foundation. This partnership is under the banner of Moving Images and marks an ongoing partnership that explores the shared space between art and cinema. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome our speakers. We have Yasmina Karaja, Director of Rupture, Screening at DIF, Sarah Abu Abdallah, video artist, and the panel will be moderated by Ali Rosh, who is a producer from Spike Film and Video. Please give them a very warm welcome.
Hello everyone, my name's Ali Roach. I'm a producer of artist film projects based in the UK, where I develop and manage a programme of moving image commissions for a contemporary art centre in Bristol called Spike Island. In this session, From Theatre to the Art Gallery, we're going to look at alternative sites for moving image exhibition, and in particular the movie theatre and the art gallery or museum, and what this means in regard to working with the medium. Through a conversation with artist Sarah Abu Abdallah and filmmaker Yasmina Karaja, we're going to look at how cinema and contemporary art, and what this might mean, the spaces of cinema and contemporary art, and what this might mean in regard to differences to approach, whilst also looking for crossovers and similarities. We're going to explore what the differences of context within these works of film and video mean in regard to making and the production of these works and how they are distributed, received, and disseminated. So I just wanted to start the session really by asking Yasmina and Sarah to introduce themselves in relation to the contexts that they work and the thematics that they work with. So Yasmina, if you could start.
Hello, I'm really thrilled to be in Dubai again with Rupture this year. So thank you for having me. I'm a writer, director. I work in narrative fiction. Really getting into film, I started in theater and in fine arts. And then ultimately when I arrived to film, I felt like it was the medium that had what I loved most about theater and about the fine arts in one. So it felt like, you know, just craft-wise, the right thing for me. And I guess my work thematically explores stories of alienation, specifically related to refugees, immigrants, survivors of war. I'm very interested in work that allows people who are often on the margins to be seen, because usually they're not seen. If they're seen, it's very stereotypical in cinema, I find, or in some films. And I think my theater background also influenced me to work with actors in a way that is a bit of an art therapy approach, I would say. So the films are fiction, it's a fictional narrative, but what I do is I invite first-time actors, non-actors, and trained actors to bring their own experiences and channel their own experiences into the work. Yeah.
Thanks. Before we move on to Sarah, I think perhaps it might be a good point to screen a clip of Yasmina's work.
So this is the trailer for Rupture, which is the short film that's playing in Dubai.
Reality, ruthless, rock and roll. Reality, ruthless, rock and roll. You really want to soften your R's. You can actually soften and create changes in the R. In general, the limbs do not control.
if you'd like to introduce yourself and the context within which you work, and perhaps how you define yourself as a filmmaker, or perhaps differentiate yourself.
So I do identify myself as an artist, not necessarily a video artist, but I, for some reason, end up doing a lot of video because of what video has, the capacity as a medium to just like engulf all other mediums. Yeah, so I think speaking of that, I think.
I mean, you work. I mean, video is one aspect of your practice. You work
Yeah.
across. You're like multidisciplinary in regard to the kind of mediums that
Yeah,
you
so
use.
sometimes it's about translating a conversation. Sometimes it's very project dependent what the end result looks like, and sometimes it's not. The end point is not a film, for example. It can be, the project can be us talking together, and then the result will be a documentation of just people sitting down in a room. Or also it can be a cinematically produced film, or it can be just me shooting videos on my phone and editing them.
And sometimes the video is part of a wider installation of your work in gallery.
Yeah. Or sometimes it screens in film festivals. It can, and sometimes it functions in both contexts.
So perhaps now would be a good time to give an example of some of your work.
So this clip that we're showing is actually a work that I made with a collective called Abtal. And it is a collective that's a WhatsApp conversation. And we went to an abandoned school in Kuwait, and we filmed there, and we made the work.
أذكر يمكن بس مرتين دشيت الحمام بالمدرسة. كنت صدق أخاف من الحمام. بس مرة كنت قاعد أمشي زين في ممر داعوس بين المدارس، وأنا أمشي كان مرة واحدة يصكني سهال. خفت أزق سروالي. فهذه يمكن أول مرة وآخر مرة أروح فيها الحمام وأزق. بس كنت أخاف من الكتابات اللي مكتوبة وظلمة الليتات كلها مكسرة. ما كان في شيء يعني تحس إنه بس ظلمة وكل شيء مغطى بماي. أتمنى يكون ماي، يعني احتمال يكون بول مزق. ما يندرى شنو.
It's still going. That's it.
Maybe moving on from that, but in relation to that clip, because looking through your work, and as you've described, you use video alongside other formats, but also you use video in different ways, I think, in your work. So there's a few works where you're employing, you know, like self-shot, sort of documentary-esque material, but there's other ways where you're kind of like mining YouTube material, and this is part of a bigger installation.
Also, sometimes I do use video as an object, so I will map it, and it will be a moving painting or a video painting. So that's something else.
So maybe a conversation about creative process to try and think about ways in which that might be different for you both, coming from the different spaces that you're producing within, but also maybe where there's some crossovers. So Yasmina, just wondering if you could talk through the process behind developing your film projects, and maybe behind writing. Like, where do you start? Where do you come to a film, and then what do you go through in terms of thinking around writing and directing for film?
Usually for me it starts with a question. I find that often there are just these questions that personally I want to answer for myself. And so the development stage, which is script writing and coming up with the idea, I start with this question, this thematic question, and then I go out and I ask other people to be part of the conversation, you know, because I'm curious, you know, do other people think the same way, or do they experience the same thing that I'm going through? And so, for example, with my first film, Light, it was about a man who is tasked to perform the Islamic pre-burial ritual on the body of his son in a hospital, in the confines of a hospital that's in Canada. And the question for me at that point was, what would death feel like away from home? So it starts really that simply. And then I started conducting interviews with people that have gone through grief, some war situations, others not, immigrants, and I collect all that data, and then I start the screenwriting process. In Rupture, for example, it was a bit of a different situation because I just had this idea that I wanted to co-create that film with Asad, Hussein Salam, and Wazira. And Rupture is a film about 4 Arab refugees that are roaming their new city looking for a public pool, and on their journey, their traumas start to resurface. And so what we did is we created these workshops where we started to ask questions about, you know, who they are as people, what they've been through, and then their characters. What are the overlaps? Also the places of discomfort. What are they comfortable talking about? What are they not comfortable to talk about? And that created the script. So I guess for each project, it does start with a question, but then it is a big collaboration for me with the actors, first and foremost. Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. So it is scripted, it's not improvised performance, but it's coming from the workshopping.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not improv. I mean, there are bits and pieces of improv in the work, but it's all a fictional narrative.
Yeah.
And I find that to be really interesting, especially if working with first-time actors. They've gone through traumas, and sometimes it's more responsible and also more interesting to have a character that is not you. You know, unlike documentary where you're telling your own story, this is a different sort of method to channel these personal experiences, but through something else. Yeah.
But you're starting, I guess, with an open-ended approach where you're not quite sure where it's going to take you. You've got an idea about...
Well, actually, no. I usually have a script that's ready,
right,
and that's just kind of my work, my writing, and then I workshop it with the actors. So it changes based on the conversations that we have. You know, sometimes like I would be having lunch, and this happened in Rupture, and one of the actors told me the story of what happened to him in Syria, and I heard that story, and I thought, you know what, this is such an incredible moment. Because he was talking about, you know, a very traumatic experience that he had. And I asked him, and I said, would you mind just literally telling that story in the film in one of the scenes? And so it ended up being in the film. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Sarah, for you, just thinking around at what point film and video comes into your work and how you think about how you're going to employ that. And perhaps... for you, at what point you're considering the gallery space or the space of display, whether that's present in the early stages of making the work or that comes later?
Yeah, I think, as I said, it's very project dependent. It's very open-ended. Sometimes the place where the work is shown is important in the beginning to consider, and then it doesn't matter anymore. Sometimes I have preferences to where it's shown and how it's shown. Sometimes I don't. Is that?
So when you're developing a new work that you know is going to employ film or video in that, can you describe how you go about making work?
I'm very much influenced by cinema, and I love cinema, and I think I always want to make movies. But then, so I think that's why video, but also I've been trained as a painter. And sometimes I wake up and I want to be a sculptor, and sometimes it's research, and we're doing research and we want to compile all this research into a story in a video. So yeah, that's, I think it always sometimes starts by writing, sometimes starts by speaking to someone. Sometimes it's a question, just like you said, what do we feel the same way? How do we speak about it? What is it that language can't translate that we can do with something like a moving image or a painting or a poem or a story that we can't convey that we can't just translate to each other otherwise.
And because you work with text, you work with subtitling quite a lot in kind of working with a narrative. Does that come after you've shot material? Because your work's very immediate. It's kind of
it's very intuitive. It's an intuitive process, and it's not usually. Sometimes certain footage, when they were shot, there was no intention, and then in the editing process, it becomes something that it's not. So it becomes recontextualized. And then weave together to make a story.
Okay, and just moving and just talking a bit more on thematics, and I think very broadly some kind of commonalities between both of your works is kind of explorations of identity and explored through both of your practices and social and cultural conditions. Do you think you could talk a bit more specifically about what you're interested in specifically in exploring in this and how you employ that in your film practice? Maybe Yasmin, if you could start.
Yeah, I think identity is part of everything that I've done thematically. And for me, I think it's also about not just showing what is there or who someone is, but also who they aspire to become. Because I think, part of, for me, part of the truth is not just in a person's character, but also in their dreams and their quest. And in Rupture, for example, a lot of the conversations that took place with my cast were, questions that they had to answer, which is who am I, and, where do I want to be or where do I want to go? And then the combination of both these things ended up being the characters that were in the film. Another aspect of identity also for me is connected to dealing with trauma. I found, one of the examples that you heard in the clip, which is the accent reduction training. I didn't even know that thing existed, but I found this video on YouTube, and it's these ways where newcomers, when they go abroad, they're trained to get rid of their accents. And I thought that was so interesting because, your accent is such a, integral part of who you are. And how to roll your R's and how to do all that. So for me, what that was in connection to identity is often I found from also working with my cast, when dealing with the trauma of war, part of you wants to actually erase, erase everything about you to start a new life. And it can be a really painful process because at one point you think you also have to lose aspects that make you who you are. So that was a big conversation that we had as a director and cast. You know, how do you create that shift and still remain authentic to who you are? Yeah.
And do you see, so it's kind of a running theme amongst others through most of your work to date, which you're producing for cinematic contexts, but just kind of, I was interested hearing you now, but also reading about the kind of the seed of an idea that came around that training, and I was just wondering, are you ever interested in exploring these things in any other way with filmmaking?
You mean as in a different medium or through film?
It might be using film, but maybe not necessarily thinking of film in the movie theatre or in the cinema.
Right.
Or kind of.
Yeah, I do have I started in theater at a really young age, and then I moved into fine arts. So these aspects influence the work that I do in cinema now. I mean, in film now, for sure. For me, I guess my direction right now is more rooted in a theater approach to film, specifically working with actors and working with first-time actors and non-actors. And what I really find interesting is bringing trained actors and non-actors together in a scene and kind of experiencing what goes on there. And you know, if you think about it, I mean, intention-wise, really, it's seeking authenticity. You know. Of course, there are great trained actors that can go and do a performance, but to get someone to translate their personal experience through fiction, I find is very transformative. So I'm not quite sure if there are other mediums that I'm pretty happy in film.
Okay. So Sarah, maybe if you could talk a bit about how you're exploring issues of identity through your work and in what way, and I guess specifically in regard to film and video, but you are doing it in other ways as well, and how they kind of are relating with each other.
I think identity and representation and expectation are a very tricky arena, and there is a lot of expectation on representing your identity and where you come from and who you are, although it's a very complicated subjective experience, and it's not what others impose on it at times, and there's a constant struggle there between being truthful and authentic to your own experience as a political being, or as a person positioned in certain geography, and then versus what the expectation is about who that should be, but also. Yeah, and it's very much about whose gaze is it that is viewing the work, and their own agendas and your own, and how do you negotiate that? It's very real, and it's a struggle.
And how because they're kind of quite running issues that you're kind of exploring through numbers of your works, not just your video works, and I'm just wondering how you're addressing those things, or you know, what you're interested in kind of confronting with that.
Yeah, this is a tension between the personal and the impersonal, and how maybe there is no such thing as the personal, as impersonal, as a maker, but then there is also the other gaze that makes something. So, for example, if you're making a work about trauma and war, then it will be because you went through it, for example, and examples like that. So there is a simplifying of the narrative and your identity in order to maybe turn it into a commodity that can be translated really easily. I think, to simplify who a maker is in order to consume it.
Okay. I think related to that is a conversation around narrative in both of your works. And so through narrative, you're addressing some of these points that you've made. And Yasmina, you've touched on this slightly, but you work with a more traditional approach to film and filmmaking, but the narrative that's present in your work is very restrained. It's kind of like that's kind of very clear in terms of your approach with the shorts that you've made. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about your approach to narrative specifically.
I think I'm constantly trying to subvert narrative, you know, or our expectation of what narrative should be. And what you said was so interesting about that struggle between the personal and the impersonal, because it's true. I mean, it kind of ties into what we were just saying about the concept of identity as well. But I mean, for narrative, I just try to tell the story in the most honest possible way, to be honest, just to put it simply, you know. I just try to find moments of truth with the cast, and then that's sort of the approach. And then I try to challenge certain perceptions, whether it is related to identity or to the characters themselves in the movie. I challenge them by subverting what they're going through. But is it a conscious decision to sort of restrain your use of kind of direct narrative through, say, the scripts that you're writing and kind of focus in on the characters? Or do you think that's a byproduct of the way you're working in the early stages in focusing on the actors that you're working with and the input on the story that you're telling? I think it depends on at what point, you know. I don't necessarily think it's intentional when I'm writing the script. When I'm writing the script, I'm just trying to get at the simplest, most authentic way to just tell the story. So I'm more invested in the emotional aspect of it. Once I start working with the actors, and when we move into post-production, then that becomes more of a conversation. Because I believe even in post, when you're cutting a film, you're often rewriting the film in some ways. So then it becomes a bit more intentional for me. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And with Sarah, with your video works, you employ a documentary camera style often in some of them, not all of them, but a sense of an embodied camera, exploring the space while you're playing with narrative through the use of text, overlaying the image. I wondered if you could talk a bit about an interest in working with the personal and fictional narrative, and often within a visual art context in moving image, you see a subversion or a rejection, complete rejection of narrative. And I wondered what your thoughts were on that and in terms of your interests with filmmaking.
Somebody was telling me how narratives are dangerous, and I understand this. Because, yeah, we come up with these narratives that are not necessarily true and all of that, but I really love stories, and I grew up reading fiction, and I consume a lot of stories, and they entertain me, and I really love stories. And with the work, yeah, it is a non-linear narrative, but I do think in narratives a lot, and there is things in the montage of like rhythm and like a climax of the arc of the story, all of that. So I do love narrative, and I do think in narrative, as dangerous as it is.
Why do you think it's dangerous?
So I think the theory behind the danger of narrative is because we try to draw our experience as a story. That maybe doesn't have to relate to reality much. So you become unrealistic because you draw a story of who you are, of who you want to be. That is just very oppressive. Yeah, it is related to so many things. I'm just like in my head now. that, yeah, an idea of who you are and how you play in this world. So narratives are dangerous, and expectation and all of that are, yeah, they can be very destructive and violent.
In terms of working with and against narrative with your work, do you think you're employing that just in the film products that you're making, or do you think you're also working with that in the way that you're displaying them? Does that ever come into...
Yeah, it has, because at the end of the day, it's about inducing a feeling. And it doesn't, I just said that video can be just a component of that, or it can be a whole experience. It can be an immersive or a tactile or whatever experience. So yeah, that's also very structured like a narrative, like a story. I'm taught, I'm educated to read the word in stories. Yeah, so.
Thanks. I'm just wondering, actually, in conversation about those sort of thematics and their employment in the approach to the way that you both work, I was interested to know what filmmakers or artists actually are informing your practice, if any.
Yeah, I mean, I have this memory of being young and watching an Iranian short film. And as cliche as it sounds, literally I felt like that was the moment I was like, I'm going to be a filmmaker, you know? It was like vividly. So I mean, Iranian cinema has influenced me immensely. Kiarostami, Panahi. I just love the restraint and the depth and the simplicity of it. But I also, you know, love Andrea Arnold and her approach to social realism and the way, you know, the way she shoots, the use of camera in her work. And then I have to mention the Dardenne brothers, which have inspired me a lot in terms of process, because I mean they do something very similar in working with first-time actors and non-actors. Yeah, that's.
Sarah, I mean, it doesn't have to be filmmakers, it could be visual artists, contemporary artists.
I mean, this is really, really tricky, because every day there's someone you're obsessed with. And it doesn't have to be a film, but every day there's like someone exciting out there that you want to be. Or you
I mean, it could be even a writer or what artist, novelist.
Yeah, at the moment today, I can tell you who I'm like into today. This morning, I'm really like into Fellini, Toby Dammit, the short he made. I watched it and it made me want to make work. I really like Sophia and Maria's work, Patrick Staff, the work you produced. That come to mind this morning.
Yeah, and is that in terms of how they're working with moving image, or more to do with what they're addressing through their work?
Yeah, I mean both, definitely. I mean a work of cinema or a work of video is both of that. So it inspires you visually. They go hand in hand, of like the content, the context, the story, like all of it goes together. Yeah.
Okay. Moving on a little bit, just thinking again about ways in which an artist working with film and video and a filmmaker making film for a cinematic context, how their experience of actually making a project happen is different, and there's some practicalities in regard to that that separate those two things. And so it's just wondering around how you logistically make a film project happen or an art project happen, and kind of commissioning opportunities, or how your films are funded, Yasmina, you know, or if actually, you know, you have a practice that kind of doesn't require those things or tries to not require those things. I'm just interested to know the differences there.
Yeah, it takes a village to make a movie, and it also takes a village to make a short film. I'm developing my first feature now, but the films that I've made so far have been short films. Yeah, it's a long process. You know, you start with development, you are workshopping the idea, working on your script, meeting with all your key creatives. Just it's all this conceptual movie that's playing in your head, and you're trying to see it in your mind, and then you move into pre-production, where you start to find your locations and turn everything that's conceptual into something that's concrete, and then you have production, which is another completely different story. And I love production because production is when everything comes together and you just arrive on the day to the set and find the most truthful moments, with your actors. And then post-production is when you get the footage and you see it. And the rough cut for me is always an extremely difficult thing to go through. And then you start shaping your film again. So, I mean, it really feels like, my experience with it is it almost feels like it's this thing that just keeps shifting, and changing based on a lot of elements. The core of it remains the same. What's on the page will remain the same to an extent, but there are so many factors in film, It's not, it's highly collaborative. And so part of the challenge sometimes to me, somebody that's coming from theater or from more of a fine arts background, is to find a way to keep the process intimate and personal, Because it's different. When you're painting a painting, it's just you and the painting. And when you're making a film, you're working with so many people. And also being very clear about your intention behind making the film and making sure that your team is making the same film as you. I was very lucky with Rupture. I worked with, they're here, David Findley, the producer, and Dean Isa, the casting director. And even to cast this film, we spent a month just knocking on doors, just going. We went to every falafel and shawarma place in Canada, I think, to be like, we need Arab. It's a problem, casting or trying to find Arab actors abroad. It's not as easy. And the age exactly for kids, and also there's some stereotypes that go with casting too. So I mean, all of these are challenges, and they, depending on where you're at in the process.
And how did you fund the film?
So the funding, well, right now I'm based in Toronto, so there are a lot of grants that you can apply to. So we applied to some grants, and then I made a short film that earlier, other shorts or whatever, you win awards through them, and then you can use that money towards the work that you're doing. And then, yeah, it's mainly through grants, I would say. But this one was different than my first shorts. It depends on the scale. This was a bigger film, so we needed a different budget. We wanted to shoot a very specific type of camera. And I think when you're starting out and stuff, some of it is also some favors. I work with my friends at this point, so we support each other that way. If somebody works on my set, I will support them with their project. Yeah, that's for funding. Yeah.
But I mean, at the moment, it's a very kind of tight kind of group of collaborators.
It is, and I want to keep it that way. I think that's very important. I think it's important to surround yourself with people who are on the same page when it comes to the types of films that you want to create, especially in independent cinema. Because sometimes it's tough with independent cinema. You have an idea that you're very passionate about, but let's say it's not like, it's not a great pitch or something. And these things are also important, to get your film made. So to balance that, to stay around people who will support that artistic, intimate aspect of it, but also to surround yourself with people who understand the industry well, to help you navigate and even sometimes with wording things, it can make a big difference. And I used to say, no, I'm just going to do it my way, and You know, I don't want to. And now I'm starting to understand the power of bringing something that might be not necessarily commercial and allowing it to have some form of a commercial production. Because these stories should be made and they should be invested in. Yeah.
So for you, it's like a concern and a consideration that you've found a way of working, and it's about kind of, I guess, it's intimacy,
Yeah.
and how to retain that on a bigger scale.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, so much of it is the people that you surround yourself with, but it's also your approach to the work. So when I'm on set, there are certain things that I just clearly discuss with the rest of the team, you know. I don't know, I think even the gaffer on set should know what film you're making and why you're making it, and, you know, if there's a certain thing related to sound, you know, if you don't want people shouting around your act. I mean, these things seem trivial, but I find that they're actually the heart of a successful collaboration. And also to ask everyone to, you know, ideally find something personal in the project for them. It starts as, you know, your film starts as your baby, and then it kind of, yeah, and then it becomes more of a collaborative experience with everyone involved, and that's that's what I love the most about making films. Yeah.
Great. Sarah, I mean, I know that I think you've mentioned that you work collaboratively or kind of in collectives. So maybe you could touch on that a little bit in answer to the same question around how your work gets made, what opportunities have been there for you or you see on the horizon, and how you fund your works, or if, you know, or if perhaps you, many artists make work where they or strategically decide that they can make works where they don't require funding, so that they can continue their practice while also, you know, having more ambitious ideas where they're, you know, applying for certain funding schemes or commissioning opportunities. So,
budgets and creative freedom are very related. So in the context of cinema, and that's how I understand it, the bigger the budget, the less creative freedom you have, because so many people get involved in it. It becomes corporate, it becomes commercial. There are so many stakes at risk. But then, on the other hand, once you don't have any budget, then you have so many limitations, and it is always a fine balance. So yeah, like a work can be made with $0 really easily, but then it might become really frustrating to not be able to get an actor, or like pay an actor, or just do this effect, or yeah. So it is this funny thing about budgets and what you can do and what you can't do, and also who's funding it and who does it. So if I don't know, a production company commissioned you. They want it to be successful. They want to have revenue, all of that. If a museum is commissioning you, it's very different. So yeah, in terms of how I make work, I started off making work with $0 because I didn't have any. Now I do get grants, and I do get commissions, and people will email me and say there's this budget for this show production, and it's not with video art. It's much less than cinema for sure. It's at the moment. I mean, it depends on the artist, because some artists make work in cinema quality, and it is with cinema budgets. But for video art, it's much less, and many artists will have to contact many organizations to request money. So that's how it works.
okay. So we haven't got that much long left. I think it would be a good point to open out for questions if anyone has any questions.
Good afternoon. I want to ask Yasmina, you were talking about the importance of casting. You would go around places to look for actors. So what are the factors that you look for which makes casting so difficult, or what in particular are you looking for insight?
I mean, I think it has to do with process. To be specific, the short that I was referring to introduces 3 first-time actors and war survivors. To me, it was about authenticity. It was about creating a film where the process was as meaningful as the actual film. So creating an experience that is beyond just making a film. Yeah, I mean, it was difficult. We went to, I mean, it was when we were doing casting, we were in Vancouver, and we just walked around. We called people. We, walked into stores. At some point, I mean, I was in Surrey every single day for a month. I think people were getting worried. She keeps asking for actors, for kids. Do you have kids? To find the 4 actors. But it was honestly one of the most meaningful experiences for me. And I think the cast, they didn't understand how big, the production was. They thought this was, they didn't. And then to see the transformation, how we started with the rehearsal, seeing these videos, and then seeing the film, the finished film. I mean, it was an incredible experience. But yeah, I guess to answer your question specifically, I guess for me it's about my intention behind the process for making the film. And usually it's rooted in some aspect of attempting to be authentic with the work. I think I answered your question.
Hi, this is actually for the floor. Whoever wants to answer it, either Sarah or Yasmina. But previously you guys talked about narrative, and I think personally, narrative is actually the root of identity, whether the way you express things. When you actually break it down, you have story, and then you have telling. So what is the story that you want to say, and what is it and how do you want to tell it? So also that goes in hand in authorship in whatever you do. So how is it that do you create the story world, and how do you create empathy in that story world? How do you create the authenticity that then connects with empathy, with the story that you want to say?
I think you start by seeing people, I mean, it's that simple. Just seeing people for who they actually are, not your idea. I think I'm speaking specifically because all the work that I've been doing involves immigration, and it's specifically the perspective of someone who is an immigrant in a Western country. So for me, a lot of it is seeing people for who they are, and not reduce people to traumas, or to creating characters that are multidimensional, and because that's the real thing, Instead of kind of capitalizing on this, we're talking about narrative, this narrative that you hear over and over and over again, trying to see things from a different point of view. And so much of it is working with first-time actors, or with people who have had that experience personally. Because as I said, I start with something very personal to me, something that I feel very strongly about, but then I want this to be a larger conversation, so I reach out. And when you reach out and you ask someone, what's your story? I mean, instantaneously, I think there's empathy created just in that conversation, because you're asking for someone to reveal who they are to you, Yeah.
Sarah, do you?
Yeah, I wanted to say something, but I was saying that maybe you can't, I do personally believe that you can't dictate someone's experience viewing something. You can't tell someone how to feel. Maybe that's why it's very free form. But also there are tricks you can do. There, I think, also being honest in the way that you make a work translate, like people feel it. If you feel a certain way, people can feel that you. I think, yeah, honesty is just like as a maker.
You're talking, Jasmina, about trauma from war, but you just said that you don't want it only to be about trauma. I'm writing something that has to do with Syria and Colombia and the effect that the trauma brings into people, not the country, but the people. Yeah. But I can talk from my experience because I'm a victim of the war in Colombia. How do you balance this trauma but not have trauma be the protagonist of the story? How to make it light without belittling it, but how to show the trauma without making it extremely dramatic and just so miserably sad that you don't want to watch it? I don't know if it's clear.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. Honestly, it's a struggle because I find when your intention, I guess you have these intentions when you create a film, and then you share it with the world. And there are all these eyes that are viewing it. And we bring our own biases and our own stuff when we watch a film. In some ways, it's the aspect of reflecting, you know? So it's a very challenging thing. It's a very tricky thing. For me, again, I reach out. So when I worked with these kids, we would do this thing where we say, you know, who am I and who is my character? What are aspects of me that I'm comfortable with and what are aspects of my character that I'm uncomfortable with? So off the bat, we're talking about discomfort. We're talking about, you know, so it just kind of starts organically. And then we start talking something very important. What are we comfortable sharing and what are we not comfortable sharing? So then, for me as a director, I understand the triggers. I understand that there are these aspects where I'm not a specialist, you know? So I can't go there with a first-time actor or somebody who's not trained to do that type of work. But, you know, it's also very simple. I mean, when I was around Asad Hussein Salam and Wazira, and they were in Canada for only 4 months, I thought that I'm going to go there and we will be talking about war all the time. That wasn't the case. We were talking about Salman Khan and Bollywood films and the latest iPhone and, you know, relationships and I don't know. I mean, you know, they're kids, you know, they're teens. So that's part of it, you know. And I saw that. I saw the real thing. But what was interesting, though, is underneath that, there was always the big elephant in the room that always went back to the loss, somehow. And in some ways, I felt like these things were a way to cope, perhaps, but an inspiring way to cope, because there's this resistance through imagination constantly that was going on. Yeah, it's tricky. I don't know if I found the answer yet, to be honest with you, but I'm searching.
Hi, I just wanted to say that for me as an Arab filmmaker, it's very refreshing to be watching a panel with two Arab, like technically, as you said, artists. So my question is, how do you deal with issues of self-censorship and self-containment, being an Arab, when you want to release something? And if you have any tactics that you've used in the past and just like persevered with them. Thank you.
I think the worst kind of censorship is self-censorship, and it's the hardest. And it is you not allowing yourself to do certain things because you think it's not a representation of who you are. But also, I talk about this with friends a lot, about censorship and friction, and how without friction there is no, what is it, heat, energy, movement. yeah, without friction, there's no movement. There's no going ahead. So in a way, it's a blessing to not have it all easy.
Yeah, censorship. I think for me, it's about the plurality of identity, you know? Yes, I'm Arab, but that's not one thing, you know? It's many. And so I start from that place. I start by owning that and being proud of it because I am, but also being committed to, you know, be honest and yeah, just be honest regardless. But again, I feel like there's a privilege in that too because I'm making films, you know, I make films in Jordan or in Canada and there are there are some, but it's not as severe in terms of censorship. And so there's freedom in that way. Yeah.
My question is for Sarah. You were saying that, sorry?
Yeah, I see.
Okay. You were saying that narratives and fictions are dangerous from your point of view. I'm now curious to know what do you think of mockumentaries? And the second question is, don't you think that European reality waves and Iranian cinema, for example, achieve this long-lasting emotions that is really close to reality?
I think the thing is with documentaries and objectivity, and if a documentary is not a fiction in some way, I think it is because you pick a certain narrative and you focus on it. There's no such thing as like an objective truth or reality, even in documentary. So there's that, and in that sense, narratives are dangerous because you can't just make anything into anything. And about lasting emotions? Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, I think they do. Oh, I'm saying dangerous in terms of dangerous in the sense is not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not. When we say danger, the thing is, I'm saying that dangerous in the sense that it is directed. It is aggressive, so it's not even. I don't know if it's about like this doesn't discredit that there's like great works of art and a great narrative. And I told you I love stories and I love narrative and I understand the word in narratives. And I acknowledge that narrative is this thing that can be used, and it is used, and we can't really escape narrative.
Okay, unfortunately we've come to the end of this session, but thank you so much, Sarah and Yasmina.